I think it was 2 years ago, online, we were in some work together that we had met through a colleague, Jennifer, out on the island, a physician. And as you were talking, I'm like, oh, I need to know this woman. Like, I remember hearing you and thinking, hey, A, she's doing like the most amazing job and the most interesting job I've ever heard of. And B, like, she's just attacking it and tackling it in a way that is just so beautiful. And so we connected, and I felt this immediate kinship with you. And so I want to, I want to honor that, because I think the ways in which you approach others and you approach work is just such a welcoming component. So I know we're going to talk about psychological safety, but I feel like you embody it. So thank you for being here.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
We're thrilled. So, okay, psychological safety. First of all, let's ground everyone. It's a term we hear quite often, in particular in healthcare. Now, what is the technical definition?
Yeah, so I think there's probably a couple of technical definitions that are out there. I think I utilize Amy Edmondson's definition because I really like how she breaks it really into two parts. So Amy would tell you that psychological safety is a climate where people are, one, comfortable expressing and being themselves. And I'll come back to this a little bit because it's important. And two, where people feel comfortable sharing their concerns and mistakes without fear of retribution. And I think it's really important to distinguish the two pieces of that, because it brings us to two different understandings of the really important parts that make psychological safety. One, which is where you're comfortable being yourself at work, is, can I actually come to work and actually be who I really am? Can I really show my true self? And I think for me, an example of this was really as we were working through the pandemic, and I was leading our response at Island Health here on Vancouver Island through the pandemic. We started up town halls. And in the town halls, we, as the vice presidents, we would stand up and give a little bit of an overview of the work that we were doing. And I remember one day early in the pandemic, and I'll probably start crying again, but we were talking about what was going on. And we were at this very difficult point where we actually didn't know if we had enough PPE for people. We didn't know what COVID was. We didn't know what we were dealing with. We didn't have a vaccine. And now we were in this place where we didn't know if we had enough PPE for people. And we were talking about what were all our alternatives and things like that. And I started to cry a little bit as I was talking about it, because for me, there was this weight of being in a leadership position and trying to make calls that were going to affect people's lives. And we actually didn't know what to do. And in that moment, I was embarrassed to be crying in front of kind of whoever had called in for the call, which on that day I think was around 800 people. But what I found out after that call from the floods of emails that came into my inbox was that people in that moment felt safe to also be scared, and to also be able to feel like they didn't know what to do, and to feel like they were failing their teams. And so that piece around being able to express who you really are, being able to express what you're really feeling, becomes really important in terms of creating cultures where people can really thrive and be safe at work. So there's that first piece, which is, can I be who I really am? If I'm queer, if I'm part of a different community, can I really show up in that way? Those are all really important pieces. The second piece, which is around, if I make a mistake, will I be persecuted or will I be punished? Also becomes really important, because we can't innovate and we can't make improvements without mistakes. And so if we're going to get better at the work that we do, and if we want our teams to exceed and excel at what we're doing, we have to give them a soft landing space when they make mistakes, and we have to expect them to make mistakes. And in fact, we have to celebrate mistakes. And so those two components become really important to think about when you think about how you're going to, as a leader, create a culture that is really safe for people from a psychological perspective.
it's interesting. You've really highlighted how it's about being human yourself,
Mhm.
but also allowing others to be human
Yeah.
and giving grace in that.
Yeah.
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 So why is it such a challenge in workplaces? Why does this, like, it seems like, okay, you should be human. Like, that seems like a really simple statement.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why
Um,
does it play out so differently?
yeah, it's a huge challenge because I would say if any of you were trained in healthcare in the era that I was, or particularly in the era before us, you were taught very much that it's incredibly important to be professional at work. So in your adult training as a person in university and in graduate school or whatever you did, you were always taught that being professional is very paramount. So we come into it with this. We also were trained in the workplace by the boomer generation, which was very much about leading in a very different way, not necessarily about vulnerability. And so there's a lot of cycle breaking that we need to do if we're going to show up at work in a different way, and it's not always easy because our work isn't set up for that. Many of us also were brought up as kids in an environment where it wasn't okay to make a mistake, where it wasn't okay to not do the right thing. And so not only do you have your own internal family systems issues that you're working through in trying to show up in a new and a different way, but we're also in a workplace that was largely created and set up in the 50s, and we haven't moved far from that. And so it becomes really hard to come into a workplace and create psychological safety when the leaders who you report to don't necessarily value or understand psychological safety. There's not a lot of infrastructure that supports or promotes psychological safety because we haven't necessarily built that into the system yet.
You're highlighting two components. One is your own personal kind of way about you. And the second is the area around us, so the culture, the milieu, the infrastructure, the ways of being.
Mm-hmm.
That's all made up, right?
Yeah.
Like, those are like social norms we've identified and social ways of being, and yet it's very different than what we want it to be. So what guides you as you navigate that environment?
Yeah.
And yourself?
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say, I want to go back to why I really wanted to come to this campfire chat, because I've been to a campfire chat before, and I think my favorite thing is at the end we get to hear from everyone on the call and learn from each other. And I think that that's really the beauty of how we get smarter and better at these things is hearing from all of you. So I can't wait for that piece. I think for me, some of the pieces that really ground me are a strong belief in the fact that everything that we navigate is around polarities. So we are constantly, when you think about it, psychological safety in the workplace, I'm going to navigate the polarity of team safety and individual safety. And those don't always mash up together. So what's safe for my team and creates safety for my team may not be what individuals on my team need. And I think that's a really important thing to think about as a leader, because oftentimes what makes psychological safety so very difficult is that it requires us to actually know the people on our team and know what people need in order to feel safe. And I think that that's where we get a lot of pushback on psychological safety, is because a one size fits all approach really doesn't work for people. And so you will often need to spend a lot more time with individuals, getting to know individuals and helping individuals navigate in order to help them feel psychologically safe. So one of the things that I often will do is, if I know that I'm going to have a meeting where I'm talking about certain things or bringing in new ideas or bringing in a directive that we need to work through, and I know certain people on my team are going to react differently to that, I will either have a conversation with them ahead of time to get them prepped for that, or I'll have a conversation with them after. And I know that's really difficult, particularly in healthcare where you might have a span of control of 200 people.
Yeah.
And the ability to actually do that becomes pretty impossible. And so, I'm sharing some of these things that work for me in my context, and they're going to be really difficult. And this is why psychological safety is really difficult to implement in a system, because it is a very individual approach in understanding what individuals need to feel safe, and then translating that into what of the mesh of what everyone on my team needs to feel safe can I create as a team safety approach. And what does that look like? And I don't always get it right, but it really is that matter of really understanding what do individuals need, and then how do we bring that into something that we can kind of get at least 80% of an approach that works for everyone in that space. And it's hard work because it requires really understanding people at an individual level and what safety means for each person.
Well, and you're actually highlighting there's some universals. Like there is an individual aspect to it, but there's also some universals that people need to feel safe. They need to feel heard, they need to feel valued, they need to feel connected, they need to feel good at something.
Yeah.
And so how do you weave in those universals? I know you have a nice team. It's a nice small team. And so it's relatively easy to really know people. But thinking back to when you had a big team, what were some of those universals you used to help guide you?
Yeah. So I think it's really important. There's a lot of work going on right now around emotional exhaustion in healthcare and in healthcare workers. And I think that this becomes really important because really the emotional exhaustion comes when we don't feel heard or we don't feel seen. And so how do you create an environment with your team where people feel heard, where they feel that they can bring their ideas forward? And so, I think a lot of it is around, and this is, Margie, one of the reasons why I love working with you and your team so much with Thought Architect is because there is actual infrastructure for safety that we can create. So in the policies that we can create infrastructure that supports psychological safety in the way we set our meetings up. So, what we're really learning as we work with large groups of people that we're trying to bring together around the province to deal with these wicked problems that we have in healthcare is how do you set that space up so that you create a space where everyone can contribute in a way that feels safe for them. So some people are going to come to that table and they're going to be able to talk and say whatever they want, but you have to recognize that there's going to be people at the table that aren't going to bring forward their ideas. And so how do you create a facilitation plan where you allow people some quiet time to reflect and then bring them in and create space for them to share their ideas? Because oftentimes we only hear from the loud people at the table. And if you don't actually create that facilitation plan where you're actually holding space to allow people to reflect for a bit and then creating space for them to bring their thoughts back to the table, then you will create a plan that is really only built on the loud voices at the table. And so how you create spaces where people can come in and feel heard and feel seen and feel like they can contribute becomes really important. And sometimes we do that just by putting up a wall where people can put up their ideas because people may not want to speak at the table. But it really involves taking the time to really create that facilitation plan when you're bringing people together or when you're bringing your team together that allows for multiple ways of people providing input at the table. And then I think the other piece of it that becomes really important is around this piece of, and I think you'll probably bring it up later, Margie, but psychological safety is not that I feel comfortable all the time. Right. So teams that have high psychological safety actually do conflict really, really well, but it is idea conflict. It's not personal conflict. So this is where, skills like saying, okay, I'm going to put this idea on the table and let's talk about it, right? So then when people are responding and picking that idea apart and making it better and layering onto it, it's really about the idea. It's not me saying, oh, I have an idea and I think this is a good solution. And then when people come at me, I feel like I'm attacked. And so there's ways that we can build in a really great way of letting people get their ideas out and then building on that idea and having really great conflict around the idea. Because what we want is we want everyone to contribute to that idea so that at the end of the day, we have the very best solution possible. And we can't actually have that if people feel too scared or they don't want to say something against that idea because someone's feelings might get hurt. So it's really important to recognize that there can be really high conflict, good conflict in teams that have psychological safety, and there can be discomfort. And that doesn't mean that there isn't safety, and it doesn't mean that we can't have the conversation. We need to have those conversations, but we have to create the safety amongst that team or at that table so that we can contribute in a really good way that isn't about personal conflict.
Yeah, yeah. Conflict will be uncomfortable inherently.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah.
And so you can structure it so it becomes less uncomfortable.
Yeah.
In any number of ways you've identified.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's an additional component that's just I want to pull on, and that's it's not just how you set it up. You know, you talked about you as a leader modeling, as a facilitator leader, being able to design and make sure that people have multiple ways and being sensitive to that, multiple ways of contributing. But there's also an element of how do you show up? Mm-hmm. How do you be a good group member? How do you assume positive intentions of others and know that nobody's coming to work to do a bad job?
Yeah.
So what guides you on your personal side?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think for me, one of the big learnings that I've had around leading for psychological safety has really been my own personal journey and my own personal growth. So there's a part of leading for psychological safety that is about creating the context, creating the infrastructure. So do your policies actually support the way you want to be as an organization? So for example, are there actually the language in your policies around leave related to mental health leave, for example, things like that, are they actually supportive and safe? Or do they actually almost penalize people for that type of leave and stuff like that? So there's lots of ways that you show up as a leader, and you need to look at the way you're creating the environment that people are in. And that's a really, really important part of leading for psychological safety. The other really important part about leading for psychological safety is that it's just like with our kids. Our kids don't learn by what we tell them. Our kids learn by what they watch in us. And so how I show up as a leader every day in every situation becomes really, really important for how I create safety on my team. And so the growth that I'm doing in learning about myself, in learning about how I manage stress, in learning how I manage conflict, all those pieces become really important for how I show up as a safe leader. And sometimes the safest thing that you can do as a leader is say, "Whew, wow, that's a lot. And I don't know what to say right now. I don't have an answer right now," right? But it's about really being able to show up in a space where you can really listen to people and hear what people are trying to present to you. There's brand new research that just came out. I just saw it yesterday around how when we actually listen and validate people's emotions, we actually exponentially build trust. And I think this becomes really, really important around psychological safety, because if I know that I can show up at work and actually express how I truly feel and be heard and validated in that moment, I now can work through that emotional cycle that I need to work through to get to the other end of that emotion, as Brene Brown often talks about, right? Emotions are cycles. They have a beginning, middle, and end. And if we are not validated and seen in that emotion, we never get through, we get stuck, and that's where emotional exhaustion happens. So for me, to show up as a leader that can create spaces where people can come and say, you know what, I just need you to know right now that I feel completely incompetent in what I'm doing, and I'm really scared that I'm messing this whole thing up. To create a space where people can come and say that, and I can sit there and say, oh, that's a lot to hold. That's huge. Tell me more.
Yeah.
That allows people to work through that. And I share that example because that's a recent example where, we're all trying to work through the massive problems in healthcare right now, and there are no simple solutions. And I would bet that most of you in this room and most of our colleagues across the system feel woefully inadequate to deal with the issues that we're facing in healthcare right now. The problems are huge. I feel overwhelmed often. In fact, yesterday, my team will tell you I called the meeting short and said, everyone leave your computer and go for a 20-minute walk, because nothing good is going to come out of us continuing to try to deal with the problems at hand. But we have to have space to be able to express that and get to the other side of it so that we can then get into creative mode and then solution. But if you don't have that space, then you hold all that while you're at work because you don't have the safety to express it. And then you show up in your real job, which is being a partner or a parent or whatever else you do outside of work, and you're crappy at that because you've been holding all this emotion inside of you and all these feelings that you need to work through. And it just perpetuates this cycle, right? And so really what we're doing in creating psychological safety environments at work is actually really helping people not just be better employees and not just be better colleagues. We're actually creating better parents, better partners, better community members. And that's why psychological safety for me is so incredibly important, because it's actually the work of helping people become their best person. And I think we owe that to people. We require so much from people at work every single day that we owe it to them to at least allow them to leave the workplace and contribute to all the other amazing things they do with their lives in a really beautiful way. And for me, that's why I find psychological safety so incredibly important. I'm so passionate about it. And I know that I only know this much about it, and there's so much more that all of you hold, and that we have to learn about how we lead for safety.
You're guided by the belief that people are whole, and that you lead in a whole way to support that wholeness in people.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah.
Nice. I think that's a perfect place to pause.